Hi, everyone. Thanks for logging into this talk on the Spaights of Derry Castle. For you, those of you that don't know me, my name is Arlene White, and I'm a native of Ballina, Killaloe, and I'm also the current chairperson of the Killaloe-Ballina Local History Society. Now, this talk was delivered initially to the Killaloe-Ballina Local History Society in St. Flannan's Cathedral on the 6th of July. So I got a little bit hooked on the Spaights. We had found an oral history collection back in 2018, and it was recordings of 80 of Killaloe and Ballina's residents, and recorded in the early 90s. And many of those people have since passed away. But some of the ones, especially on the Ballina side, talked about the Spaights and the land and the landlords and everything, and that some of their parents or grandparents had worked for them. So I kind of thought that I know very little about Derrcastle, even though it's just out the road. So I started doing a little bit of research and I got totally hooked. It kind of became my COVID project as such. But the more I dug into it, the more I found out. And there was links related to my work, my full-time job. And there's lots of information that I still haven't uncovered, and lots of questions I still have. So it'll be a work in progress, I'd say, for a number of years to come. So if anyone has any information or feedback that they'd like to share with me at the end, you can put it in the comments or contact us here through the local history society. So the Spaights originated in Woolwich in Kent, and the first Speight, who was a James, that came to Ireland, appears to have settled in County Clare in the late 1600s. So there's a massive amount of information on the Speight families and the powerful positions that many of them held, often inherited or gained through marriage. But I focus my research on the direct line of Francis Speight, who bought Derrcastle in 1844. So skipping a few generations, we move to James Speight's great-great-grandson, William Speight. William was captain, excuse me, in the 65th Regiment, North Yorkshire. He served in the American War of Independence, and he fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. He was also High Sheriff of County Clare in 1791. This was a position that was also held by his father Thomas in 1697, so was possibly inherited. So once I started digging, I found, as I said, two links related to my job. So I pass Corbally House near Quin most days, and this is where Captain William Speight had his seat. He married Millicent Ann Studdart in 1782. His new father-in-law, Thomas Studdart, owned Bunratty Castle since about 1720, and I think William and Millicent actually got married in Bunratty Castle. The couple resided at Corbally House, and they had 10 children, and their fourth son was Francis Speight, and he was born here in 1790. So the second link I found relates to St. Finian's graveyard in Quin, a graveyard I really enjoy wandering around old graveyards, and this is one that I had passed and had gone into. So Captain William Speight was laid to rest in this graveyard in the only vault in the cemetery. And the inscription reads, erected for the family of Captain William Speight, who died on 7th of June, 1801. And this was the father of Francis Speight. So at the young age of 22, Francis Speight married Agnes Patterson, and she was the daughter of Lieutenant James Patterson of the Royal Navy from Kilrush. So in 1812, Francis and his new father-in-law bought an old established business in Limerick City from Robert Harvey. And his family had developed it over several years. And I think this is where Harvey's key came from. The business was on Bedford Row with access to the Limerick docks, and it focused mostly on the importation of timber from the USA and from Canada. And from the highlighted section here, you can see a timber yard, you can see the crane, and access to the quays, most likely where the business was established. So Francis moved to Limerick in 1815 and established F. Speight and Sons, a business that continued in Limerick for over 150 years, but it wasn't always run by the Speight family. So based on the map shown previously, you can see the quay walls and a crane in the background, presumably looking up Bedford Row. So we'll just go back to that one for a second. So you can see the crane. So presumably looking from the area of Limerick Boat Club, looking up Bedford Row. So Francis was reported to have been an enterprising young man, and in the 1820s he became involved in the emigration trade, so even before the famine. He was already sending his ships out to North America and Canada empty or in ballast for timber to supply from his business in Limerick, and he saw an opportunity. Landlords in Ireland at the time saw forced emigration, or as they called it, landlord-sponsored emigration, as a solution to their overcrowded estates with tenants who couldn't afford to pay the rack rents. So basically, Francis saw a business opportunity. He had a number of contacts among Protestant landlords throughout Limerick. So a lucrative business developed for him. In 1831, the cost per passenger from Limerick port on one of Francis Spaight's ships was between £2.10 and £2.25 to Quebec, and from £3.25 to £3.50 to New York. So basically, the cost of the ticket decided your future, really, and where you were going. So while Speight had a number of ships regularly sailing from Limerick to Canada and the USA, the most notorious one in his fleet was the Francis Speight, named after himself and built for him in the early 1830s. In November 1835, the ship set sail from Limerick with a crew of 18 men and 216 emigrants heading for Quebec, where it was set to return with a cargo of timber back to Limerick. Patrick O'Brien, a 15-year-old Limerick boy who had been working on the dock stacking timber, signed on as a cabin boy on the ship. So on the 3rd of December, during a storm, the Francis Speight was upended off New Brunswick by strong gales, and 3 of the crew were immediately lost overboard. Their provisions were washed away, so the crew had to survive on whatever rainwater they could gather in their handkerchiefs. After 16 days, and there was no sign of rescue in sight, the captain, who was Timothy Gorman, decided that in order to save the remaining crew from dying of hunger, one of the crew would have to be killed to keep the others alive. They drew lots, and Patrick O'Brien, the young cabin boy, drew the short straw. And it was suggested afterwards that it had been rigged against him. He was, I suppose, the youngest of the crew, and he was the son of a poor widow from Limerick. They cut his wrists, but the blood flow was very minimal because after 16 days of starvation and dehydration. So Captain Gorman ordered the chef to cut his throat. After this, 3 other members of the crew were killed, after 2 of them became deranged, and all 3 were eaten by the remaining crew. So on the 23rd of December, so 20 days after the accident, the last 11 crew members were rescued by the AG Nora. The captain of the Francis Speight, it is said, was actually eating the liver and brains of a crew member when they were rescued. So after spending some time in a workhouse in Falmouth in the UK, the 11 crew eventually got safely back to Limerick, and they were tried for murder and acquitted. Some reports say that there was never actually a court case arising out of this. So afterwards, Francis Speight made a public appeal for the survivors and the relatives of those who perished. He said that some of the survivors had arrived in such a state of wretchedness and were mutilated by frost that they were rendered helpless and unable to work or fend for themselves or their families for the rest of their lives. Francis himself donated £10 to the fund, so equivalent to about €1,400 today. Was this generous or incredibly mean? I don't know. He possibly took in about £450, over €30,000, sending 216 immigrants to Quebec. I know he lost his haul of timber, but yeah, you have to wonder with the huge wealth and the flourishing business if he could have donated more. The Francis Speight ship was salvaged as it had never actually sunk. It had just been waterlogged, and it was re-registered in London by Joseph Shepherd in 1838. So Captain Timothy Gorman seemed to have been unaffected by the tragedy, and the following year he went back to work for Francis Speight as captain of the Borneo. Now, I don't know if I'd have got on a ship with him after hearing that, but from 1838 to 1841, the Borneo made 2 voyages a year to Quebec. He was really working on getting himself back to a normal life, and in July 1838, he took proceedings against Catherine O'Brien, the widowed mother of the cabin boy, Patrick O'Brien, who was the first to be killed and eaten on the ship. So Captain Gorman said he had no peace for the last week on account of the defendant who threatened to take away his life and his children's as well. She denied this, saying that all she did was fall on her knees and beg that he would tell her about her son that was killed, and he instead abused her. She was duly bound to keep the Queen's peace in the only legal proceedings to arise out of the death of her son. By the mid-1840s, Gorman owned shares in at least 2 of Francis Spaight's ships, one of them being the Jane Black. This was reported to be the largest vessel ever in the port of Limerick at 1,300 tons, and Timothy Gorman was the captain. This was most likely the main ship that took hundreds of Derrcastle tenants to their new life abroad. So in 1842, we see an advert for emigrants in the Limerick Leader advertising Spaights ships, first of which was due to leave Limerick from the 1st of April, 1842. And you can see Captain Timothy Gorman is the captain of the Jane Black. And further down, Captain Daniel Gorman was the captain of the Governor. And I believe both men were from Kilrush, so I believe they were actually brothers. So the money was flowing, obviously, because in 1844, Francis Speight bought the Derrcastle estate, and a detached Burgess estate comprising 3,000 acres of land with mansion house and offices on the most picturesque and frequented part of the Upper Shannon near Killaloe. He paid 39,500, which equates to about 2.7 million euro today. Now, this was actually quite exciting when we got it. We had never seen a picture of the original Derrcastle house. We were only going on descriptions that we had heard of it, but this was forwarded to us by a gentleman called Julian Riddick recently. His mother's family were the Gartside Spaights from Derrcastle, and he kindly shared this with us. So Derrcastle estate had been for sale for a number of years prior to Francis buying it in 1844, and it was for sale by Michael Henry Head. So there was 2 adverts in 1840 aiming to sell the estate, both of which focus on the totally different advantages that the estate had to offer. The Dublin Evening Mail on 7th of August 1840 shows an advert focusing on the beauty and splendour of the estate, with mountain scenery, the mighty lakes like oceans of liquid silver, the valleys teeming in fertility. The advert also highlights that the mansion is of importance. It stands on an elevated position above the level of the water and is entirely suited to a family of high pretensions, with corresponding offices within and without. So some of you might recognize the original entrance gates on the road between Ballina and Portrue. And the driveway up to Derrcastle, these were, as I said, the original entrance gates. The driveway up to the mansion, which we saw previously, was approximately about 3.5 kilometers long. So at this time, this was how the success of a landlord was measured, by the length of his driveway. I suppose it also allowed the landlord to travel through his estate on a daily basis. So while the first advert trying to sell the Derrcastle estate focused on the beauty and splendour of the estate, the second advert in the Limerick Reporter on the 20th of March 1840 highlighted more the earning potential on the estate. So it says, manure of a most peculiar and valuable quality, and the quantity inexhaustible, is obtained from Lough Derg for the entire estate at all seasons. It is a blue shelly marl, which is dredged from the bottom of the lake into boats by the tenantry, for which quays and harbours are arranged. It has been analysed and was found to contain 50% of carbonate of lime, with other valuable properties set forth in the analysis. The advert also states the more elevated divisions of these estates abound in slate quarries, so long celebrated as superior to any in Europe, and are now in full operation with the splendid outlay of capital by the Imperial Slate Company, in whose employ several hundred men are permanently engaged to the great advantage of the proprietor of the estates, who participates in the income under the deeds of contract. The specimens of copper and lead mines afford every reason to believe that, if properly brought into operation, they may become a rich source of wealth. So I suppose they were appealing to people that liked the splendor and the beauty, and also the earning potential of it. So the Derrcastle estate had previously belonged to Mr. Michael Prettyhead, Esquire, and it was sold by his son Michael Henry Head. Michael Prettyhead died on the 27th of June, 1836, at the age of 66, and he's buried in Castletown graveyard near Portrue. So Michael Prettyhead's grandmother was the daughter and heir of Samuel Wade of Derry, County Tipperary. And Michael inherited Derrcastle, and his brother John inherited Ashley Park just outside Neenah. The initial advert for the estate stated that it comprised of 4,500 acres. But when Speight bought it in 1844, it had been reduced to 3,000 acres. So it appears that Michael Henry Head had sold off roughly about 1,500 acres of the estate to pay off creditors. After buying the Derrcastle estate, Speight quickly started to clear it of tenants who couldn't afford to pay the rack rents, as they said. It's reported that he made the tenants on his estate take down their houses or cottages before they left to ensure that the land was left clear for him. So he then began consolidating the land for agricultural use by amalgamating the small farms and creating farms of about 100 to 150 acres. So his plan was never to allow subdivisions of farms on the estate again, because he felt this might lead to a reintroduction of tenants, poorer tenants, I suppose, who wouldn't be able to afford to pay rent. According to Speight, the estate had been very poorly managed, and large numbers of paupers had been allowed onto the estate, so in effect living there free of charge. And obviously he wasn't in favour of this. As a magistrate, a justice of the peace, a merchant, and a landed proprietor, Speight was called to report to the Select Committee on Emigration in July 1847. He reported that he had got rid of all the paupers from the Derry estate through forced emigration, or landlord-sponsored emigration, as they called it. He's also recorded as reporting to this committee, "I found so great an advantage of getting rid of the pauper population upon my own property that I made every possible exertion to remove them. I consider the failure of the potato crop to be the greatest possible value in one respect, in enabling us to carry out the immigration system." So that was probably one of first quotes or links to Francis Speight that I found when I started researching the Speights and Derrcastle. So you can see it kind of tweaked my interest to see what else lay in store. When asked by the Select Committee if immigration was a profitable sideline for his ships, he replied, "Most certainly, because our ships would otherwise go out to Canada in ballast. And the result is that whatever we get in the way of passengers is so much gain for us." However, he defended these statements and his landlord-sponsored emigration through his reports that during the first year of him owning the Derrcastle estate, so from 1844 to 1845, he had applications from about 100 people from his estate wishing to emigrate, and, as he said, he sent them out. He reported that every ship that sailed was filled at once. The Limerick Reporter in April 1847 reports of 100 poor families, averaging 500 persons, gladly surrendering their small holdings to the proprietor, Francis Speight, and set off for America in the Jane Black, where they are to be landed free of charge, with the intention of setting up in Canada as farm labourers. So as part of his evidence, Speight read out 2 letters to the board, which had been sent by 2 emigrants from the Derrcastle estate, writing back to family members, talking about their life. So the first one, which has no sender's name, but it was written from one sister to another on the 26th of March, 1846, and it was sent to Job Kennedy of Killaloe, County Clare, Ireland, to be forwarded to Jeremiah Howard of Towntinna, parish of Ballina, Killaloe. This lady sends her regards to all her friends and neighbours and thanks them for all their kindness before she left home. She's encouraging her sisters to come to this country and telling her sister that the clothes they would have would do them well. She finishes her letter, however, by promising that if they don't come out, she will send money to them as soon as she can. The second letter presented by Speight was from a Joanna Kelly, who had settled in the township of Vaughan in Canada, and the letter was written to her father, Michael Gleeson, Newtown, near Killaloe, County Tipperary, in October 1846. So she writes all about the 6-week passage from Limerick to Montreal, then to the United States, before they then return to Toronto. While life seems to be pretty good, Joanna does write about being lonesome for her friends and family, but she does state that if she was in the old country, as she called it, she would come back out again. She does hope that if none of her friends and family come out, though, she would hope to return after about 3 years. My guess is that this probably never happened. She's encouraging her brothers to come out as they would do well. However, she's worried for them on their trip across the Atlantic. At the time, obviously, a lot of people that set sail on these ships from Limerick and other places never actually made it to the USA or Canada. They died on board. She does agree that her and her husband, Oliver, will send money to Quebec if her brothers were to travel to Canada, so that they could make their way up to them near Toronto. She signs off, I think, almost believing that she will not see her family again. Hoping to see you all again, and if not, to meet you all in heaven, is the wish of Joanna Kelly. I think one thing that hasn't changed over the decades is the difference between men and women writing heartfelt letters to home. Her husband then adds at the bottom of it, "Dear father-in-law, send us a letter and let us know how my father is. Also, whether Con and Margaret will come out or not. No more at present. Remains yours affectionately to death, Oliver Kelly." So Speight went on to report that after seeing these letters, many people from the estate were happy to follow suit, and that he had many more applications from people looking to go out. However, in the late 1840s, there is a report of Speight bringing the sheriff, along with 50 policemen, to Derrcastle to assist him in evicting a number of poor families from the estate. The families in question boarded up their windows and doors while they were in the house and refused to come out and leave their homes. So obviously not everyone was as willing to leave the estate and emigrate as Speight was reporting. But by the early 1850s, he had rid his estate of approximately 2,000 pauper tenants and was admired by other landlords for his efficiency and his business skills. When questioned about the number of tenants from his estate that had emigrated, Speight argued that he always provided free passage for the entire family and was therefore providing a new life for them in Canada or the USA. So you'd wonder, is this true? Would they have perished as poor tenant farmers in Derrcastle? I don't know. So at the same time, Francis was hosting parties and events in Derrcastle. So in 1853, the Limerick and Clare Examiner reported on a great 2-day event held by the Limerick Coursing Club and hosted by Francis Speight in the fabulous surroundings of Derrcastle Domain. So Francis himself appeared to have had a number of winning dogs on the day or during the event. One of the guests was Sir Philip Crampton, who was the first baronet and president of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and he travelled from Dublin especially for the event. So obviously Francis Speight was an important person in those circles. So shortly after buying the Derrcastle estate, and while he was in the process of clearing it of all the pauper tenants, Speight was also working on the establishment of the Derrcastle National School on his estate. So in 1845, just a year after he bought it, he made an application to the Commissioners of Education to have a school built to serve the children of his tenants. So the application detailed the building of a schoolhouse in County Tipperary, the name to be Derrcastle Male and Female School. It was to be located on the banks of the Killaloe Lake in the townland of Newtown, parish of Templekelly. It was to be enclosed by a wall and have a garden for agriculture. And Speight was prepared to give 6 Irish acres, of which the board could take the site of the schoolhouse and yards of as many feet as they pleased. So on one hand, he was clearing his estate of tenants, and on the other hand, he was offering land and money for a school to educate the children of his tenants. But I suppose you'd have to ask, was it a different class of tenantry that he was catering for at this stage? This property would be given at a lease of 5 shillings, so roughly about €23, for 3 lives, so 99 years. And the suggested trustees would be William Speight, Thomas Speight, Corbally Quinn, Henry Speight, Corbally Quinn, all men of property and all brothers of his. But they weren't going to get rich from it, really. So yeah, I don't know. According to Francis Spaight, the estimated attendance would be 100 males and 100 females. So he was estimating that 2/3 of the parish would actually attend the school there. He assured the commissioners that the school was necessary as there was no school within 3 miles, except, as he quoted, one bad hedge school in the parish of Temple Kelly. He was even willing to pay the local contribution towards the building of the new school, and he was also prepared to keep the house and furniture in repair at the expense of his own estate. So while the Commissioners of Education seemed to be in favour of the building of the school, nothing happened between this and 1848, when a further application was submitted by Speight with the proposal of a different site, which was much more central and favourable. So I don't know whether the Commissioners of Education refused the original site near the lake, or was it that there was a larger population in the second location he suggested, or another thing would be that where it was built, maybe the land wasn't as good as it was down the lake for agricultural purposes. So we don't know that. So in September 1848, a grant of £100, so almost €9,000, to build the school was offered, with an additional grant of £11 and 5 shillings for fixtures and fittings. But a few months later, the grant was cancelled, and a proposal to build a model farm school costing £600, which equates to about 52 or 53,000 euro, was put forward. So even though these schools were extremely expensive, these agricultural or model farm schools were probably favoured as a result of the famine, because it was felt that better education around agriculture might ensure that such a tragedy would never reoccur, really. By April 1849, plans were well underway, and the lease of the land was taken by the commissioners. So it was 18 acres, 1 rood and 12 perches, at an annual rent of £13, 15 shillings and 9 pence 3 farthings, to be paid twice yearly. Speight proposed that his tradesmen could build the school, and then, if it met with the approval of the commissioners, he'd hand over the whole building to them. He obviously thought that he could save money by getting his own paid tradesmen, I suppose, to do the work. But they refused the offer and demanded the £200 local contribution be debited to them as soon as possible. He agreed, and he paid the contribution in May 1850, and things eventually got underway. So the aim of these schools was to supply agricultural instruction to the more advanced pupils attending the literary schools, and setting an example of skillful cultivation to the farmers in their neighbourhood, to educate and train a class of young men destined for agricultural professions as agriculturists and land stewards. So we can see this appears to have been successful when we read the oral history interview with Joe Manley, which was recorded in the early 1990s. So his father was a land surveyor, and he attended Derrcastle Model Farm School, as did Joe himself. And Joe talks about his early life helping his father. So he says, "My father was a land surveyor, and he surveyed the land for all the local farmers, measuring for bogs and involving turf and all that. Years ago, people used to cut turf, and he could tell by measuring the stack of turf how much was left in the ground. The same thing applied to the land. I often helped my father when he was measuring the land. He used to measure the land with a chain, and if you wanted to measure a perch, say, I would hold the rings of the chain and put a mark there, and he would come along then and measure the square, the area of the land. He was paid by the farmers. He used to draw maps. If there was some dispute over land, he'd draw a map and mark on it where the land was, and that map would be taken maybe to court. He often had to attend court." So accommodation was provided at the school for a certain number of boarders, of whom one would always be a free pupil, selected and recommended by the agricultural inspector, the others being paying pupils. So fees would be £6, over €500, payable in advance. So the school and boarding wasn't for the ordinary person in the area, really. For this fee, They would be dieted, lodged, and have their washing done in the establishment, and would receive literary instruction from the schoolmaster and lectures on agricultural science and practical instruction on the model farm. They would also be required to assist in all operations. So it was like an early version of Garteen College in Roscrea. The school officially opened in late 1851, and by January 1852, Speight, who was the manager of the school, reported attendance of 103 pupils. But the high attendance didn't continue for long, and just over a year later, the attendance had halved. So a number of factors could have caused this. There was mass emigration as a result of the famine. Speight himself was clearing estates. Parents were keeping children at home to help with the daily chores around the house or around the farm, and it wasn't compulsory to send children to school at this time. On February 16th, 1861, Francis Spaight died at his home in Derrcastle, and he was buried in Castletown Ara Church of Ireland graveyard near Portruke, in the largest vault in the graveyard, and I'd say in most graveyards, and you can see it's blocked up currently. But his family would have been laid to rest in there with him as well. So after Francis died, his oldest son, William, inherited the Derrcastle estate. It appears that William and his family were actually living there at the time. So William took over the management of the Derrcastle Model Farm School, and he was also a senior partner in F. Spaight and Sons in Limerick, working alongside his brother James. So William was born in 1817, and in 1845, William married Anne Patterson, who was quite possibly his cousin, because if you remember, William's mother was Millicent Anne Patterson. The couple had 2 children, a son, Francis Wyndham, born in 1847 in Rome, and a daughter, Caroline Mary Gertrude, born around 1850 in Derrcastle. Strangely and sadly, both children died in Derrcastle in 1865, both after short illnesses. So after Francis died, his second son, James, inherited F. Spaight and Sons, timber, corn and coal importers. James was born in 1818 in Limerick, and in 1850 he married Elizabeth Allison Eckford, daughter of John Eckford, in Edinburgh. He lived in 77 George Street, which is now O'Connell Street, a house possessing the finest balcony in the street and the only example of a lamp fixed in the fanlight to give light to visitors at a time before the corporation undertook the public lighting of the streets. In 1853, he was High Sheriff of Limerick City, and later in 1856, 1877, and in 1883, he was the Mayor of Limerick. He was also President of the Limerick Chamber of Commerce from 1871 to 1892. He was MP for Limerick at a time before voting by ballot was introduced, and each voter had to be guarded by police and military. And he was also Justice of the Peace and Deputy Lieutenant for County Tipperary, as was his father Francis. So possibly titles that were inherited or jobs that were inherited. James was offered a knighthood in 1887 by Queen Victoria in connection with her Jubilee. So as you can see, quite a prestigious and important man in around Limerick. He died shortly after being offered the knighthood in 1892 and is buried in St. Mary's Cathedral in Limerick with a fairly modest headstone by comparison to the rest of his family members. The inscription just reads, "In loving memory of James Speight, BL, who died 21st of January, 1892. So as they had no children, F. Spaight and Sons became the property of James's wife. It can be assumed that she returned to Edinburgh. She sold the business in 1893 and possibly returned to Edinburgh because there is no record of her in Limerick or in Ireland that I can find after that. The business was bought by James McMahon Limited, timber importers and timber hardware merchants. So this is now McMahon Hardware Supplies on the Dock Road. But the new owners traded under the name F. Spaight and Sons for almost another 100 years. And as you can see here, one of the receipts from 1929 is for J. Crotty, Esquire, on Main Street, Killaloe, buying from Spaights. and an advert from 1940. So they kept it going until the 1980s, really, as Speights. So the new landlord of Derrcastle, we've heard differing reports about him. We've heard that he was well liked and well respected both in Limerick City and Derrcastle, and he was known locally as Billy. So local people remember him being collected from the 4 o'clock train in Ballina and being driven out to Derrcastle by horse and carriage. On one occasion, he was shot at from the wood near his own gate, and there seems to have been great shock locally that anyone would hold a grudge against Mr. Speight. But yeah, as I said, we've heard that he may not have been as well liked as it seems. This is taken from the Schools Collection, County Clare, and written by a Peggy Kiley from Killaloe. This was the folklore collection. William Speight was the landlord who owned the Derrcastle estate, Killaloe. He was a bad landlord, but his family is now extinct. His ancestors got the land in the time of Cromwell, and it's now divided up. So the tenants of Mr. Speight's land were not allowed to keep terrier or hounds. As a result of this, the deer and hares and rabbits trampled and destroyed corn and crops. If you killed a deer, you were penalised by being evicted from your home. Paint your home or drain, you were penalised by being evicted from your land. We have another side to the story then from Josie Quinlan, who passed away in 1997. So Josie was born in Ryan-Inch in 1905, and she stayed in her home place until she moved to a nursing home in Neenah in the early 1990s. So she gave an interview in 91 and spoke about her father and her maternal grandfather working for Mr. Speight. So my father, originally came from Dublin, and there was a place out in Derrcastle, and he came there. Sir William Speight owned it, and he was only 17 years of age when he came there as a footman and a waiter in that, you see. My grandfather was Connors, and he was a coachman in Derrcastle, and my father was a footman and butler in that. When they would be going visiting to a dare and places like that, my father would be on the carriage with my grandfather. But he was a very good landlord, of course. He had an awful lot working for him, and he'd buy the bags of flour and meal, and if you wanted a suit of clothes, he would give it to them. And he had a factory in Limerick, and they would pay him so much a week. He was a very good man. There was no one belonging to them left. The land was all divided up to us. Speight himself died suddenly down in his own place, and his daughter, which is actually his niece, didn't keep it on. You see, my father would be telling us all about how he used to wait on him and dress him and all that. But sure, when you were young, you used to think he was reeling. But we often said that we regretted that we didn't listen to him, because the people would have been around his age and he would have been able to trace it all. At that time, an awful lot went off to America, and he would have known it all. Speight was a popular landlord that time, but he wouldn't be now, I can tell you. Oh God, he was, because he used to keep the whole thing going. He used to give the grass down around, and he would give, excuse me, he would give 6 pence a day to the women going down weeding, and that was good money at the time. They were glad to get the 6 pence. In April 1872, Derrcastle House was burnt to the ground. The Kerry Evening Post reported on this event and stated that the house was 4 stories high and built in the ordinary style of architecture. The article also talks about the male servants who occupied apartments in the wing of the building and some 14 or 15 domestics who also lived in the house. 2 tenants were killed, and the gamekeeper had his leg amputated as a result of the accident, and he later died from his injuries. The other occupants were uninjured in the fire. One of the staff, it's reported, rescued some of the paintings in the hall, some silverware and plates before he left the house. And the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Julian Riddick, his mother was descended from the Gartside Spaights. He has this crockery in his possession, and he didn't know anything about the history of it, but he knew it came from the Derrcastle estate. So we don't know, is this the crockery that was rescued from the fire in 1872 and remained in the family? So it was never established whether or not this fire was accidental or malicious. The newspaper reports that Speight received insurance money of £5,000 for the building, £2,000 for the furniture, and £1,000 for the offices and outbuildings. but it also reports that no amount of insurance will compensate for the irreparable loss Mr. Speight has sustained. Now, it appears he recovered relatively quickly because Derrcastle was rebuilt, but on a much more modest scale. And apparently William used the remaining insurance money to commission the building of the Phoenix, a steam yacht built in Waterford in 1872 for him. This was owned by the Speight family until 1884, following which she had many owners and uses, and a long link with the Lefroys, Killaloe. It's currently owned by John and Sandra Lefroy, and it's still afloat on the Shannon every year, and they kindly provided this photo of the Phoenix in 1905. William Speight died suddenly at home on the 31st of March 1899. And you can see from his death record that his occupation was listed as a gentleman. And William Quinlan, who was Josie's father, was with him when he died, his footman. So the Limerick Chronicle newspaper records his death in early April 1889 and reports all the principal establishments since the sad event have displayed symbols of mourning. The ships in the port have their colours half-mast high, and at the Chamber of Commerce and other institutions, the blinds are half down as a mark of respect to the memory of one who was a most popular citizen and a large employer. It also states Mr. Speight's demise has removed from amongst us a gentleman universally respected by all creeds and politics, and his loss will be deeply felt in Limerick, as well as the districts surrounding his pretty seat on the Shannon. The Irish Examiner of 1899 records the details of his large funeral. The remains were placed in a suite of coffins, the inner one being of upholstered cedar and mahogany, the next of lead, and the other of massive oak, with rich mountings and Spanish mahogany panellings. The funeral was brought from Derrcastle to Castletown, and the newspaper details the largest and most represented in that district for many years. The article mentions exquisite wreaths of lilies, violets, forget-me-nots, primroses and ferns, and lists those in attendance, including some relatives of the deceased from the following families: Wyndham, Blood, Parker, Studdarts, businessmen from Limerick and Tipperary, the Limerick Harbour manager, the manager of the shipping company, the manager of the Waterford and Limerick Railway, and other landlords like Lord Donnelly and Twiss of Bird Hill. The mourners from Limerick and district were returned home by special train. And it also mentions the many people from the district of Derrcastle who followed the funeral cortege on foot, being visibly affected by the loss of a true and kind-hearted friend. So as you can see, when you read that, you would imagine a man of huge importance and huge popularity. So when William died, he was succeeded by his brother, the youngest of the Speight family, Colonel George Campbell Speight. George was born in 1831 in Limerick, and he began his military service in 1849 at the age of 18. So in 1863, he married Dorina Beretta, the only daughter of Cavalier Pierre Beretta of Corfu. And in the 1901 census, Dorina lists her occupation as a capitalist. So George died on 10th of January 1898 and was succeeded by his only child, his daughter Louisa Dorina Speight. So at this stage, there was no direct male descendants of Francis Speight. So Louisa Dorina inherited Derrcastle. So Louisa was born in Limerick in 1865, and in 1889 she married Cavendish Walter Gartside Tipping, the youngest son of Gartside Tipping of Bolton. The couple had three daughters, Daphne Dorina and Irene Maria Louisa, born in 1891, and Dorothy, who was born in 1892. And all three girls were born in the UK. So after the death of his father-in-law George in 1898, Cavendish Walter Gartside Tipping assumed under royal license the name and arms of Speight, and the family took on the name Gartside Speight. And this apparently was a stipulation in the will of Francis Speight that any heirs or anyone that inherited Derrcastle going forward would have to take on the name of Speight or have the name Speight. Cavendish Walter Gartside Speight became the landlord of the Derrcastle estate and also became manager of Derrcastle National School. Now, he was in the British Army and was regularly away from home, in particular in the lead up to the First World War. He was rising up through the ranks in the army as well, from colonel to brigadier general. The Gartside Spaights appeared to have moved to the UK sometime between 1901 and 1911, or they were travelling a lot between the UK and Derrcastle, because they don't appear anywhere in Ireland in the 1911 census. So presumably they were elsewhere. As a result, the Derrcastle estate was put up for sale by public auction by Cavendish Walter Gartside Speight through John Keogh, auctioneer and valuer in Killaloe on 7th of May 1918, with the auction due to take place in the Lakeside Hotel. The advert in the Nina Guardian on 4th of May 1918 shows that the following was for sale: a dairy, fattening and tillage farm, 196 acres of land, so obviously a lot of it had been sold or given over, and 13 perches and the house, commanding a fine view of Lough Derg, with tennis courts, flower gardens, and a large walled fruit garden stocked with the best fruit trees. The advert also states that the subscriber has the greatest confidence that such an opportunity may never again occur in this county of securing one of the best farms in Munster. So what happened next? This is a sketch of Derrcastle House after 1872. So when, as I mentioned, the original mansion was burnt to the ground, and it was built on a much smaller scale, or much more modest scale. So this is the picture. The sale of Derrcastle didn't appear to go through immediately, as we see another report in the Nina Guardian dated March 1919, which reports that the new owner, Mr. W.L. Hodgins of Nina, agreed a contract with Mrs. Speight on 27th of September 1918, and a deposit was paid. The contract was due to be signed on 1st of January 1919, presumably when General Gartside Speight would return from his duties with the British Army. But he was ill on this date, didn't return, and the contract wasn't signed. So Derrcastle didn't become officially owned by Mr. Hodgins until 14th of January 1919. In April 1919, Brigadier General Cavendish Walter Gartside Speight writes from London to the Commissioners of Education, stating that he has not been home since war broke out and sees no chance of him being there in the near future, or ever permanently. So he's now asking the Commissioners of Education to appoint a successor to manage Derrcastle National School. He also states that he has disposed of practically all of Derrcastle estate, only having retained a small fishing lodge and a few adjoining acres as a summer residence, which we think was probably Derry Cottage, which you can see here at the top of the map, the cottage. So as of April 14th, 1919, after a period of 75 years, all ties with the Speight family and Derrcastle had come to an end. Now, things didn't work out so well for Mr. Hodgins, as sadly on the 21st or 22nd of January, Derrcastle House was maliciously burnt to the ground, and it was never rebuilt. Apparently, after Hodgins had agreed the contract with Mrs. Speight, he received an anonymous letter from the small tenants on the farm, letting Mr. Hodgins know that they intended to get the land they were farming divided among them at a reasonable rate. And asking him to back out of the sale, basically. He refused because he was in fear of losing the deposit he had paid. And one evening, shots were fired at his car from behind the trees near the estate. So he reported that he then approached the tenants, offering to sell them their land, but he couldn't accept the money that they were offering, as it was only about 1/3 of the value. And the tenants stated that they couldn't pay the money that he expected for the land. So the house apparently was maliciously burnt to the ground. So as the house was still insured at this stage by Mrs. Speight, Mr. Hodgins hadn't actually taken over the insurance of it at that stage. He claimed £5,000 in damages at the Nina Assizes for malicious damage. £3,100 was awarded for damages and repair to the house. But he, obviously, as I said, didn't repair the house, and the entire Derrcastle estate was sold off in sections to existing tenants and new farmers. In 1883, the Derrcastle Model Farm School became recognised as an ordinary national school rather than an agricultural school. By this time, the house attached to Derrcastle National School was in the private ownership of the Manley family. Derrcastle National School continued to operate under the management of the local Catholic parish until 1968, with a number of principals, including Teresa Manley, Percival Lucas, and then Nellie Malampy ní Horn. The school closed its doors for the final time, and the remaining 13 pupils and their teacher, the late Nellie Malampy, were transferred to Ballina National School. And we have some photos here, courtesy of Norma Manley of the school. The Manley family, as I said, still live there. And you can see the red arrow pointing to the entrance to the old schoolhouse. And this is pictures inside. And you can see in the corner the old coat hooks along the wall for the children's coats. And there what looks like it could be an old school desk. Again, a close-up of the coat hooks. So retired Brigadier General Cavendish Walter Gartside Speight, his wife Louisa, and his daughter Irene, who became known as Winky, emigrated to British Columbia in Canada in 1919 or 1920. Irene Maria married Evelyn Arthur Grenville, Temple Gore Langton, in 1922 in British Columbia. However, the couple, it looks like, returned to the UK as their son was born in the UK in 1924. Dorothy married Vivian Archer Jackson in Kensington in 1915 and stayed in the UK. Daphne Dorina married Major General Robert Cotton Money in Kensington in 1917, and they also stayed in the UK. So it appears that eventually all the family did return to the UK, because we see Cavendish Walter Gartside Speight passing away in 1934 in Cornwall, leaving behind £4,177, 11 shillings and 3 pence. And the executor of his wills were his son-in-law, Robert Cotton Money, and Archibald Sterling, who was also a Brigadier General in the British Army at the same time as Cavendish Walter Gartside. But Archibald had actually died in 1931. Now, here we have some beautiful photos. So Dan Keogh purchased the private photo album of Daphne Gartside Speight, or Daphne Speight, in 2019. And he had shared some of the images, and we got in touch with him, and he kindly handed over the album to us to actually take a copy of all the photos that were in it. So we'd like to thank Dan for that. And the photo on the right is of Major General Robert Cotton Money. Again, that's courtesy of Julian Riddoch, who was his mother, as I said, was a descendant of the Gartside Speights. Apparently Robert Cotton Money was an amateur photographer, and he obviously passed on this interest to Daphne. So we don't know the exact year of the album, but handwritten on the front, it says Daphne Gartside Speight. So it was obviously before she got married, and it was before 1919 when Derrcastle was officially sold. So we have a rough idea of the time scale there. So this is we have, interestingly, down on the right hand side, a sketch of Derrcastle House when it was, after it was rebuilt prior to, or after 1872, a sketch of it. And then we find in the top left, this is actually a photo of it. So you can see the sketch was quite accurate. And that sketch was taken from Kevin A and Kevin M Griffin's story of the Derrcastle Model Farm School, which was published in 1997. We don't quite know who these people are, but obviously family members, presumably sitting outside the house in Derrcastle. And the photo on the right, we think is looking from the island where the actual ruins of Derrcastle sits, the castle itself, looking back over towards the land where the boathouse would have been. Again, family members. It looks like the lady on the left is sitting in a walled garden, and the lady on the right is possibly the mother, sitting outside one of the front of the house. So the land where Derrcastle House was situated is now owned and actively farmed by John Keogh and his family. And during lockdowns in 2020, he kindly let us out to have a stroll around and take some photos. So this is more or less the same view that the Speights and Gartside Speights would have had from the front door of Derrcastle House, looking down towards the avenue, and you can see the description there with land teeming with fertility and lakes like liquid silver. A beautiful view they would have had and still is today. And this is actually part of the house, remaining walls of the house which John Keogh uses as part of his farm. And you can see he's actually repaired some of the damaged stonework, and really there's great credit due to him and his family for keeping it in such a good state of repair. So that is me finished. As I say, I have a list of my sources there, if anyone would like to find out more information. And as we said, we'd like to thank Dan Keogh, who purchased the private photo album of Daphne Gartside Speight and shared all images with us. And thanks to people who shared information with me, including Paddy Collins and Leslie Carey here in Ballina, to Kevin Griffin, who also answered some of my questions when I couldn't quite come up with the answer myself. And a huge thanks to Deborah, the secretary of our local history society, who has had the story of the Speights forced upon her for the last 2 years and has probably listened to this presentation about 6 times at this stage. So thank you very much for listening. And as I said, if anyone has any further information or comments or feedback, please do get in touch with us here through the local history society. Thank you.